Antitrust law can promote many different goals, and those goals can change over time. Over the last 30 plus years, the goal has been to protect the economic welfare of consumers. Welfare used to be measured by the prices consumers pay, but today, innovation is becoming an increasingly important factor. While focusing on consumers over producers aims to protect the interests of everyday Americans, this approach has failed to protect farmers and small businesses that are at the mercy of powerful retailers.
The nutshell version of the consumer welfare standard, with apologies to my economist friends, is that if a merger or conduct promotes consumers' welfare, if it's good for consumers, then it's pro-competitive or it's legal. Or should be legal if you adopt a pure consumer welfare standard. So anything that makes consumers richer is a good thing. As opposed to, say, what I would call a societal welfare standard, which tends to say producers and consumers are both members of society, so whatever makes the overall societal pie bigger is the right way to go.
While the antitrust statutes do not mention consumer welfare, the concept became a key focal point of American antitrust law in the late 1970s and was most directly measured by the prices paid by consumers.
Merger law, Clayton Act Section 7, talks about lessening competition. But the standard is consumer welfare. Just tell me, what is consumer welfare?
Well, consumer welfare is a competitive effect that results when prices go up to consumers or quality goes down. The Clayton Act doesn't address it, as you say. The Clayton Act says a reduction in competition. And over the decades, there have been differing views of what that means.
We start with competition. The Clayton Act was designed to preserve competition. How has the conversation gotten to wealth?
Because wealth is a great indicator of whether competition is present in a market. To the extent that prices are going down and there's more choice, to the extent that we're seeing new entrants challenge the incumbents in the markets with new products or lower prices, that reflects, again, the increased power of the consumer in that market.
Over the last 30 years, consumer welfare has departed from rigidly focusing on price and quantity to incorporate concepts like innovation. Innovation was not mentioned in the 1982 merger guidelines and was only discussed in a footnote in the 1992 guidelines. The 2010 merger guidelines, on the other hand, has an entire section dedicated to the discussion of innovation and the concern that a merger could stifle the incentive to innovate.
The more interesting debate right now is the one involving innovation and the question of whether innovation is much more important than price to protect. People like Herb Hovenkamp have said, if you stifle innovation, you've done a lot more than get rid of price competition, and the harm's going to be bigger. Right. And I think right now we're in the kind of morphing stage where there's a lot of attention being paid to how antitrust should respond to innovation. There's arguments on both sides. Mm-hmm. But it is clearly, especially in the new economy and the tech economy, innovation is probably more important than price.
But it brings in the concept more and more of innovation, and how do you fit innovation into it? But innovation requires a longer-term view. It's not price-oriented as such, and it's probably far more serious in terms of impact on the economy than price.
This is a really big issue. Another big issue is the effects on innovation. When you have one company that dominates an entire realm, they don't have external stimulus to push them towards bringing better ideas to the marketplace. They don't have an external push to get them to improve their processes, to lower their prices. So we have all kinds of technologies that could be integrated into systems that we rely on now. They're not being integrated because of this lack of competition.
In the absence of antitrust, I think one of the things that we would see is a reduction in innovation. Why? because if you're an investor in something new, you need to know that you're going to have a fair shot at success in the marketplace. And if you're going into a cartel or you're going against a monopoly and nobody is policing the market, you've got no chance. So if you've got no chance.
Within the antitrust community, there is a debate over whether antitrust law should solely seek to maximize consumer welfare or aim to maximize the combined welfare of producers and consumers, a goal which is generally referred to as the total welfare standard. Advocates of the total welfare standard point out that by adopting the consumer welfare standard, the agencies fail to adequately protect the interests of small suppliers that are harmed by increased buyer power or, as it's referenced in antitrust circles, monopsony power.
A pure societal wealth maximization standard looks at antitrust this way. It says we don't care as much about what producers make and what consumers make. What we care about is are resources efficiently allocated. Most times when producers artificially raise price above competitive levels, that leads to an inefficient allocation of resources. So it harms consumers, yes, but it also is an inefficient allocation of societal resources. And as a result of that, it's a bad thing. We ought to prevent it. But I'll give you an example of where there can be a difference. In monopsony cases, in which purchasers, in this case consumers, are so strong that they are able to drive price below competitive levels, that also would lead to an inefficient allocation of resources. And yet that's very good for the consumers. The people who are doing the buying pay less.
Best way to realize what I think is the flaw in the consumer welfare is think about monopsony. So who's the consumer there? The consumer is the monopsonist, right? So are we protecting monopsonist welfare? I don't think that the proponents of consumer welfare would say that, okay? There they would be focused on economic welfare. So I think we should be protecting the competitive process that generates the economically efficient outcome.
While total welfare advocates tend to represent corporate interests, others who criticize the consumer welfare standard take issue with rigidly tying antitrust goals to welfare or economic value. This view tends to resonate with public interest groups that advocate for those who are vulnerable to the power concentrated in big businesses, regardless of whether the powerful business is a buyer or seller.
A small business or medium-sized business should have as much right to buy from or sell into a competitive market as the end-use consumer. Antitrust pretty much ignores this today, but that's what monopsony is about.
In Monopsony Power, it's the case where there's a single buyer who is, or a single retailer, a single sort of market manager that is dominant enough that you have to meet the terms that they demand of you because you have no place else to sell. So what we've seen with Walmart is, in many of the many cities in America, they sell half of the groceries already. But nationally, they sell at 40%, 50%, in some cases close to 60% of certain lines of goods. So this gives them essentially, the same way that Amazon has the power to dictate terms to the publishers, Walmart has the power to dictate terms to many of its suppliers.
I do a lot of work for farmers. I'm extraordinarily proud of the work I do for farmers. I know how difficult it is for farmers to provide, to be able to compete in the market and deal with very dominant processors. The Antitrust Division hasn't brought many enforcement actions on behalf of farmers.
The DOJ has not done a whole lot when it comes to antitrust these last couple of years under Obama. But one of the cases they did bring was in the publishing industry. And it was a case in which the publishers went to the DOJ and they said, hey, we got a problem here, which is that this single giant company, Amazon, is really emerging as the monopolist, the most dominant retailer in the entire business. They sell, a company that sells, it could be 50, 60, 70%, 80% of certain lines of books. So it's a situation, if you're selling 60, 70, 80% of your product across one platform, you are subject to that platform. You do what the people who run that platform tell you to do. So the publishers went to the DOJ and they said, this is a problem. And then the DOJ came and they looked at what was going on, and rather than taking the case against Amazon, they actually brought a case against the publishers. And they said the publishers were, and the reason they did this is because they said the publishers were advocating for higher prices. When all they were actually advocating for was an open marketplace, a competitive marketplace, a marketplace in which there was not a single dominant sovereign boss company in the middle of it that basically is able to dictate terms to everybody.
But one thing is for sure, modern antitrust jurisprudence does not appear capable or interested in protecting small suppliers against big buyers.
In a 2006 speech delivered by Tom Rush, addressing the Weyerhaeuser decision, which is the latest pronouncement of monopsony power in a market, he said that the emphasis was on consumers, and therefore the impact that would result from a combination of powerful buyers was irrelevant, and should not and would not be treated the same way as a combination of sellers.
While the U.S. antitrust world remains solely focused on welfare, other competition regimes take other factors into consideration. In some instances, this is due to necessity rather than a deliberate choice. But even in more sophisticated economies, like those in Europe, competition policy encompasses more than welfare.
Other jurisdictions that have antitrust laws. I think that's because in other jurisdictions, particularly new or emerging jurisdictions with antitrust laws, the purpose of the antitrust laws may be something broader than the consumer welfare focus that we have here in the U.S. So when you're dealing with a new economy, they're trying to get things off the ground. They're trying to level the playing field. They're trying to make sure that businesses are competing fairly. They're trying to make sure that there's a remedy for anti-competitive behavior. There's many other things going on in those jurisdictions. In the U.S., we have the benefit of an established rule of law. And so some of these other concerns that affect antitrust laws and competition laws in other jurisdictions aren't present here.
On the Commission's website, for example, when they're discussing the merger review process, they take into account factors that the U.S. does not necessarily consider, such as the ability to promote growth within the European Committee, and most significantly, whether a proposed merger will enhance the standard of living within the European community.
So that's an interesting point. The standard of living, is that the same thing as consumer welfare, what we have here in the United States?
I think it is a deeper philosophy within the European Union where it suggests not only empowering consumers in a market, but raising their standard of living as a whole. So rather than focusing on the impact within a relevant product and geographic market, the community is more likely to take into account the ripple effects in both economic, political, and social arenas.
These other approaches bring into question the current system of antitrust law in the U.S. There are differing views about how U.S. competition laws should be applied, particularly over whether antitrust law should aim to prevent bigness generally.
What are some of the other things that antitrust regulators and policymakers, in your opinion, should look at in terms of looking at how consolidation affects a citizen?
I mean, foremost, you should always look to see if someone is concentrating sufficient wealth and power to manipulate the government. And if that's the case, the people's government, the public government, if that's the case, then that's an instance in which the regulators, the antitrust enforcers should step in.
Barry Lynn believes competition policy can be used to promote more than welfare, but most U.S. antitrust practitioners do not share this opinion.
When you have real hyper-concentration of productive capacity, when you make all of a certain kind of semiconductor in one place, or all of a certain kind of piston ring in one place, that if there's a event that cuts you off from that factory, it could be an earthquake. It could be a cyber attack. It could be some kind of a conflict, a political conflict, say between Japan and China. Anything that would cut you off from access to that source of supply means that all the systems that depend on that source of supply come to a screeching halt.
If you're going to put in place a law that says at some point you are just too big and we're going to outlaw bigness, I think that's a problem. And the antitrust laws, at least at this point in time, don't prohibit you from being big. They just prohibit you from being big because you violated the antitrust laws in some way.
What role should antitrust play when bigness leads to instability in the economic system?
Well, that's an easy question. Antitrust should not play a role at all in determining whether a company is too big. That's a regulatory concern. It's not really an antitrust concern.